first, you can, thanks, Marissa. I'm going to hand over shortly to Tatiana, who is our discussant this evening, and we will then have conversation following that. So Tatiana, thanks very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome everyone to tonight's session. So I just want to put it out there that I am not an expert on microaggressions. This is just something that I felt interested in, and I decided I'll be the discussant on this topic. And I'm really just wanting to share my insights on the concept of microaggressions. And as Andrew said, we don't have finality on the topic. We're just sharing with you what has come across our experiences and just opening the floor for discussion. So I'm going to be switching off my camera just so that there is no interruption with the bandwidth from my side. So in terms of, where are we moving? In terms of a definition of microaggressions, in the research that I uncovered, we found that it's subtle verbal or non-verbal slights, insults, and sometimes disparaging messages that are put forward to people of marginalized groups. And originally the term was coined by Chester Pierce, and this was in the 1970s, and the concept was associated with racism. So the microaggressions were always towards people of color. And then later on, a seminal author emerged with a more robust or rounded definition of microaggressions, referring to it as everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to target groups. And these target groups can be quite broad. They're not necessarily people of color. It can be people from different ethnicities, different religious backgrounds, and also different origins, different genders as well. And what is important to note is that the definitions talk to the subtlety and how the microaggressions are quite nuanced in the messaging that's portrayed, that's put across to targets or people from marginalized groups. So I thought it was interesting to just look at the concept of macroaggressions and how this also informs our thinking around microaggressions, because the concept of macroaggressions talks to a set of beliefs and ideologies that justify that a group of people, generally a dominant group of people, can legitimize their interests and impose their views over non-dominant groups of people. And when I looked at the two contrasts, I thought, okay, macro, if you think of the prefix macro, it means large, big, or great. And when you look at the concept of micro, it means small, minute, tiny in comparison. And so the concept micro, for me, shouldn't really be minimized or diminish the impact of the concept in the context of racism, because I think racism is so complex, and we use these terms, given our limited understanding of some of the terminology, we use these terms to describe a phenomenon, and this phenomenon shouldn't necessarily have a diminishing impact on how people feel regarding the microaggressions. So in my experience, I've come across three different types of microaggressions. The one is a microassault, and that's racial derogation characterized primarily by verbal or non-verbal attacks intended to hurt a person. So sometimes it's through name calling, or it could be situational in the sense that you'd sometimes see a sign that says, oh, this is for non-whites only or whites only. So that would be a typical example of a micro assault. Another example would be where people fly the old South African flag, almost denoting that they don't want to embrace the new flag. A micro insult that I've come across is around, this is more at a personal level, and these are attacking the person's personal attributes. So there's an insensitivity and a rudeness that is conveyed in the insult. So it would go along the lines of, a typical example would be, I like your hair, where do you get that hair? Or you speak so well, you have such an interesting accent. Those are some examples of micro insults. And then the third type of microaggression is a micro invalidation. And this communication generally nullifies or invalidates people's experiences and realities as they grow up in a world that wants to look at things as either black or white. So some of the examples would be things like people would make comments like, I don't see color, we're all part of the human race. And that's almost invalidating or negating the fact that we need to acknowledge and appreciate differences within the humanity of others. And I thought it would be necessary to share some common microaggressions. And I think you've all probably seen some of these microaggressions. People confuse one individual with another. How's everything on your side, Zandi, when your name is actually Mbali? You know, so I've come across quite a lot of those where people are confused just because they have the same skin color. Their names get mixed up. You speak English so well is a common one, especially people that have that have studied in private schools where they got associated or they were exposed to people from different backgrounds. And so their English came with a bit of an accent, and that would be considered a microaggression when people ask you, how is it that you speak English so well? Or where are you really from? You don't sound like you're from around here. Some of the behavioral microaggressions are generally, these are associated with issues around intersectionality. So can you organize lunch for us, or would you mind collecting the copies from the printer? And these microaggressions are generally targeted at women. And if you're a female person of color, you kind of experience a double microaggression. So you're left confused. Where is it? Why am I feeling aggrieved by this request? Is it because I'm a woman, or is it because I'm a person of color? So that's where the whole double microaggression comes in. Excluding a co-worker from an after-work event due to the assumption that they cannot participate, again, that can be interpreted as a double microaggression, especially where they exclude women from after-work events. Oh no, she probably has familial responsibilities, so we're not going to ask her to attend the function. Or where people talk over you in meetings. So some of the experiences have been where male colleagues would talk over me in meetings, and it would be a case of, oh, what she means to say is, and then they take the conversation in another direction, or they try to explain away what I'm saying and redirect the conversation towards themselves. So those are some common microaggressions, and in it is this concept of intersectionality that comes into play, because you're not sure where the microaggression is directed at. Is it because I'm a person of color, or is it I'm a person who doesn't have an English accent that they can identify with? or is it because of my how I choose to associate with the pronouns? I use different pronouns to them, and that could be a double microaggression in some instances. So I just thought this would be a good point for us to just stop and reflect on what are the influences of microaggressions, and perhaps just open up some of the conversations in this direction, Andrew.
Great, thanks for that input, Tatiana. And maybe just to add another, because we have been doing in one of our tertiary institutions and talking about students in particular. And the one Black student would say, the professor would be a white male. And when they're discussing something about different groups of people or even ethnicities and so on, he would always turn to this one Black student to ask her, what is your viewpoint on your particular ethnic group? And she said she felt that she had now to be the representative for the whole ethnic group. It's not as if she had, the sum total of knowledge about that particular group, but she felt that she just felt this pressure all the time. When it went in that direction, she almost feel already, anxious that the question then about her particular ethnic group was going to be directed at her. So one see these kind of influences of it everywhere in different settings. We're talking obviously here about the workplace. Colleagues, there were a few insights from Tatiana on the topic, and you can obviously talk about any other issues with regard to it, but often to help us just get into a reflection around some of the input that was given. Here's a question: what are the influences of microaggressions? What's your view? And as we have said before, let's just jump in. And Tatiana, maybe if you can stop your sharing of the screen so that the people can all come back and we can see people participating in the conversation. Please, colleagues, what's your thoughts? What has come to mind for you in regard to what has been shared? What's been your experiences around this particular topic of microaggressions? You want to say something, Sunita? Please go for it. Thank you. Go for it, Sunita.
Andrew. It's such a difficult topic. I'm still getting my head around it because some of the concepts is around, and I'm not using it as an excuse, but some of the concepts are conversational starters. It's been embedded in certain people's behavior for life. And now a simple example is if I say something and my kids say it, the context is so different because of the generational gap. And it's like, well, mommy, how can you say that? And I'm thinking, well, that's, for me, it is, clear. And how I bring it back into the workspace is that team dynamics has a massive influence. I mean, microaggressions has a massive influence on the team dynamics, right, which makes me also think about the psychological safety. Because if I accepted it all along, and I think it's a compliment, it's a backhand compliment, it's a microaggression, all these other things, and now it creates a different element of animosity. I mean, I'm
do you have some examples, Sunita, of manifestations in the group setting? What would you say?
Let me think about a few. For example, there is a team that had a banter amongst themselves. And it was accepted because it was tolerated in the past. And it became part of their particular identity. And it could be, it's like, oh, you are, it's like, remember beans bunny, or, let me use an Indian context, oh, you are a breado, for example. And it was accepted. And then a new individual came into the team, and all of a sudden there's grievances, there is the underlying comments, but the entire team dynamics have changed. And it was based on one associated belief already in the team. So what is right, what is wrong, what is the new way of thinking, even people still adapting with pronouns, you know, the diversity issues that come in, but the subtle microaggression that comes out versus a genuine comment. And, you know, how do you differentiate it without being the educator all the time? Because you're going to have to create awareness and educate. But there's quite a few examples that lead to actually drastic consequences around bullying, intimidation, politics. Everything comes out when you deal with these sensitive issues.
Sure. No, thanks for that insight, Sunita. And Tatiana, just jump in anywhere as when you feel you want to comment. Anybody else? Yula, is it you? Is your camera on, or do you want to say something?
It's you, Andrew. Thank you, Tatiana, for that, sharing those powerful insights. And I think I was just thinking now, following Sunita's point, I think sometimes the microaggressions can be more sort of overt, and other times it can be almost more subtle. And I'll give you a simple example. So my surname is Banda. So very often, and I grew up in Johannesburg, so very often I would go into a shopping mall or into a shop, and someone would start speaking, and I'm so-called colored in terms of my racial group. And someone will start speaking to me in an African language. So I'm just wondering, what is the correlation between the intentionality of a microaggression and a more overt microaggression versus being more sort of not aware, let's call it the ignorance, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, thanks for that question, Yul. And it's, I'm going to answer you and someone else that sent a message as well. I think if you as the recipient feels aggrieved and uncomfortable by what was said to you, so it always starts with how do you feel about that experience and that behavior? Then it is a microaggression. The challenge is, how does then one feed back to the individual to say, you know what you've done doesn't sit well with me. I'm uncomfortable with the fact that you keep on referring to me in this manner, or you keep on directing me in a particular, forcing me in a particular direction. And that makes me uncomfortable. And I think that's the difficulty that one has to navigate in these kinds of conversations, because the sender of the message doesn't see it as a microaggression. I don't know, Andrew, do you want to expand on that?
If you are to think about somebody might think it's a compliment to say to somebody, you speak very good English, you know, you're a Black person.
Yes.
You speak very good English. So the person might obviously not, I don't think it's in bad will that the person sometimes not say it, sometimes it does. But sometimes it is said in goodwill, but the person receives it, as Tatiana says, almost give expression to whether it can be considered to be a microaggression. Respond and say, you know, why do you me in that way? You know, is English like? Because sometimes it is seen like that. If you are able to speak English well, then you've somehow made it. You know, don't know where you made it to, but you've made it.
Yeah.
So it is a difficulty sometimes, but I think maybe in terms of how the person receives it could be an important way to think about it.
And
obviously, some other ones are they're very clear cut, and one can say you can't accept something like that. But others are a little bit. Yeah. Go on, Tash.
Another aspect I wanted to add is also around the individual's unconscious biases. And that's also a difficult one, because you've got to bring it to their awareness that, this is how I'm feeling about what you said. And it could be based on their mental models. So they feel that they a fairly rational, objective individual. And what they're saying to you should be interpreted as a compliment, and you obviously not. And that talks to their unconscious bias. And that's again something that one has to facilitate a conversation around. How do you bring that to the awareness that you could be offending me and offending others?
Sure. Other comments, colleagues, please jump in.
Yeah, I want to agree on the mental models or the unconscious bias. I remember speaking to a line manager once who, they were talking about something urgent that needed to be done, it was quite a high profile activity. And they said I had to give it to one of the men on my team because at least I know I can push him, right? And I can be a little bit more tougher on him. So I'm like, okay, but what do you mean, right? And of course, I think he thought it's a good thing, right? Because he doesn't want to be harsh on the, I think he predominantly had women on the team. And I actually had to then point out to him that now the women are missing out an opportunity to potentially be awarded this task, right? Because, of your perception that you can't be tough on them. And perhaps maybe the way you are tough on a fellow man and a fellow woman might be different. But I guess I challenged him to maybe think about it differently, to say, look, you could still apply pressure, right? And, show the urgency and the importance of this with the women, but maybe using different tactics than you would use in a man, because now the women are disadvantaged because of the perception that you have that you can't push them as harder, right? And, it was quite an interesting, and I think he wasn't aware of something that he thought was, I guess, in a positive light, that it actually would have negative implications on the receive, I guess, on the females within his group.
And that's another good example of, Fiona, where the person might speak out of goodwill, or almost like, I'm concerned that this might be too hard work for you. It depends what it is, if it is really physical. I mean, if it is just conceptual work and a person makes such a statement, that might be something different. And sometimes the person speaks out of this kind of goodwill perspective, but and depending what you're talking about, it will not be well received. Thanks for that, Fiona. Any comment, Tatiana?
No, nothing to add. I think it's also one other thing is around the environment that we find ourselves in. So if the environment allows for these types of conversations to happen, it talks to the culture of the workplace, then it's seen as it's a common issue. You're making an issue out of something that is an everyday occurrence in our organization. So we don't have an issue with it.
Right. If there are no further comments at this point, Tatiana, maybe you want to continue, and please, colleagues, jump in and put any comments in the box if you want to share your screen again.
So if you just look at some of the consequences of microaggression, and we're familiar with most of these consequences: lack of loss of self-confidence, self-esteem, a hostile working environment, demoralization, feelings of exhaustion, that sort of thing. But I think the ones that stood out for me was around devaluing social group identities, the racial battle fatigue, and the racial trauma. Those ones struck a chord with me. In particular, devaluing social group identities, it's almost asking me to deny my heritage. So if I say to you, oh, you know what, you don't look Indian, but I have Indian heritage, or I have some ancestry that talks to Indian features, it's almost like you're asking me to deny that side of me. And that creates a situation where the person doesn't feel that they can bring their whole selves into the environment and speak openly around their way of being and their how they grew up in the earlier years. The racial battle and fatigue and being exposed to that on all fronts. So if you're in an environment where you just feel it's racially charged, there's continuous microaggressions, you almost feel run down, and there's this continuous justification and having to be judged all the time. That can actually make an individual feel like, I don't belong here, and I'm just going to withdraw from this type of environment or withdraw from the team. So one of the theories that I came across was called broken windows theory. And Wilson and Kelling basically postulated that if a window is broken and it's left unrepaired, over time the rest of the windows will be broken in the building. So this theory was examined in the context of criminal behavior, and they said where there's situations of crime and disorder, and it can be minor incidences of crime, over time it escalates to more serious offenses. So this same theory can be applied to reducing microaggressions and managing diversity in the workplace. So what they advocating is that managers and employees monitor the workplace themselves and prevent microaggressions by being vigilant around these broken windows. So where you see one slight nuanced microaggression, and regardless of the size, and if the person shrugs it off, the target of the microaggression shrugs it off, management and other employees should actually step in and say, you know what, this is unacceptable, and we don't condone this kind of behavior in the organization. And if that is reinforced over time, you kind of neutralize the microaggressions in the workplace. So I think I just wanted to reflect on this as well. When does one realize that the window is chipped or cracked, or how does one notice these things in the workplace in particular? Any questions, comments?
Any comments? Could you just repeat that reflection point, Tatiana?
So when does one notice that the window is chipped or cracked? You know, and obviously we're using that analogy in the context of microaggressions. You're on mute, Andrew.
Sorry, Sunita, your microphone is open. You want to say something?
No, I'm thinking it's such a difficult question to
Okay,
answer.
okay.
When
All
do you know the windows are cracked? Because if I think from an OD perspective, you know, it's different for every team. It could be from the morale, it could be from energy level, it could be from the well-being. It's a difficult question to see when do you know that windows crack. But if I reflect a little bit around self-awareness, if I don't receive that feedback, I won't know that the window's even cracked.
I suppose sometimes one would pick up, I think you alluded to it earlier, Sunita, you pick up that there is a little bit of tension within the group, but you're not quite sure what might be the cause of it. So these are the kind of signs where you feel things are not quite settled. The group is not quite, you know, operating in a coherent way, and and there's something happening here, but you're not sure what it is. Maybe those are the kind of signs that one would need to begin to look at, especially as the lead.
If I can just add, I think it also requires a level of, and I think the previous speaker, I forget the name now, alluded to it as well, is that it requires a level of maturity, because not only from the leader, but from the broader team. Because if there isn't that over and above the maturity and the self-awareness, there may not be the capacity to identify when the window is actually chipped or cracked. And in that way, the microaggressions could even be condoned and become double microaggressions or even macroaggressions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the microaggression is compounded over time. Yeah.
Now, certainly, it seems to be putting quite a bit of onus on the shoulders of the leader of that particular group and team to be, and I suppose it is one of the functions of a leader is to check about the health of what is happening in your particular team. And I suppose knowing about things like microaggressions also inform the leader then to be much more sensitive to that kind of thing potentially happening. Irene, go for it.
Good afternoon. I recently attended a conflict management workshop, and microaggressions came in as one of the factors that might lead to conflict. And when we were discussing the different types of conflict, the hidden conflict came to play to say, okay, one might get used to saying those statements that Tatiana showed us, like you speak English very well, you know, can you make us tea and all that, and one, you know, doesn't actually act out then to show that this doesn't go down well with me. So it means there will be this conflict that will be internally brewing up until such time that one ends up, you know, showing it to say, I don't take kindly to those things that you are doing. So the understanding is that these microaggressions, if we are not aware of how people receive it, they are more likely to be a source of conflict to a team. So one, if a leader is not aware of how the way that they speak to people or the way that they address certain things is being received by the team members, it has got a tendency of creating or being a root cause for a conflicting situation that can start, you know, coveted, but it will soon manifest when people have had it to such an extent that they can't take it anymore.
Yeah.
Hence the need for us to educate ourselves on this very topic, to understand what it is about, that the team must be able to also talk about it so that people are aware that there is potentially a problem here if you are not going to be careful about it. Temba, you made a comment in the chat box. I also think it can be influenced by bullying tendencies. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Amber. That would be enough.
Thank you, Andrew, and the team. So that emanates from I think that emanates from the fact that if someone has these bullying tendencies, it's quite obvious or explicit that you can see certain elements of that bullying, because if I look at the examples that Tatiana gave, that you speak English eloquently and well, it questions I also think besides the ethnic group, it's like you're saying, how dare you know such a good English when you don't deservedly have to know that based on your background, for example. So along those lines, I feel like there's a demeaning factor undermining the fact that you should be speaking English eloquently, so, and yet your background does not necessitate that.
That's so true, Timba. I mean, I can certainly identify with that, and I think that's also where the racial fatigue, the racial battle fatigue comes in, because the onus is left on you, the recipient of the microaggression, to explain about being microaggressed. You know, you speak English so well. Now you have to explain how you were schooled, where you grew up, and this privilege that you were exposed to. And it's a perceived privilege on their part, where you were afforded the opportunity to speak English so well. You're on mute, Andrew, sorry.
Yeah, I forget I need to press the, the space bar. Other comments? I see your microphone is still open. Irene, you want to add more?
I wanted to ask that would the context in which these statements are being uttered, you know, create, bring in a difference in interpretation or how one views the issue on whether it is whether it is meant well or whether one is really being sarcastic, in the lack of a better word, you know, to say, will the context matter in terms of what would have happened or what would be happening at that moment for one to end up saying, you can speak good Afrikaans or you can speak good Venek or whatever it is that they would have said. Does the context matter, if that is the question that we must ask?
Yeah, if I can, I guess, jump in there. I'm actually thinking of an example that happened recently. I was talking to a colleague who had gone to a meeting. So it's a female colleague who had gone to a meeting with a male colleague. And as they got into that meeting, while they were doing introductions, you know, he said, oh, you know, here's beautiful so-and-so, you know, she's here to brighten up the room. It was something, you know, very much of that nature, right? And because it was a professional context, you know, she was quite offended because, one, it feels like someone is trying to undermine your professional credibility and bring attention to whatever your so-called looks. And then, of course, it devalues your professional presence in that room. So in that case, you know, the context might matter, because maybe if somebody pays compliments to your looks in a social setting, at a braai, etc., that might be very different. So because there she was, I guess, there, you know, in the context of being a professional, trying to be credible, and someone is trying to objectify you, she certainly did find it to be offensive and also inappropriate, you know, given the setting of the environment that they were in.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Fiona. The context does give expression to what are we talking about. And I think why a person would obviously feel very offended in that context is that, will the people now see me as a Barbie girl, or are they listening to the professional input that I'm giving on this particular topic? And it's entirely, it seems to be legitimate to feel that kind of offense, especially in that type of context.
And again, it takes us back to the issue of stereotyping, you know. So now that she has been called beautiful, so beauty with no brains, you know, if whatever it is that she's going to be saying, they will not matter anymore, because isn't it, they already know that the saying that says, when you are beautiful, you know nothing. So that's why I'm saying it's subtle way of still being of still bullying a person, or of still being sarcastic, but finding ways of you seem to be complimenting me, but in fact you are not complimenting me, you are derogating me by calling me beautiful in that context, because it is not about, if it was in a context, in a beauty contest and they were there to compete, it was a good statement. But the place and the time, I think it's one thing that as leaders or as professionals, people need to start looking at it to say, is this the right thing to say, and how will it be received by the people that I am addressing when I do it in this manner? Yes. Thank you, Fiona, for the input.
Again, it points to the fact that there's a need to be informed about these issues so that we do not make those kind of mistakes in those kind of settings. Andre, I'm not going to read your long comment. I'm going to ask you to speak to it, if you don't mind, Andre. Thank you.
Hello, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I just posted a little question. I was listening to the discussion, and I'm just kind of wondering what role the individual level of assertiveness play in the perception of microaggressions. Once we enter the workplace, and this is kind of a personal view, is I think one should be able to develop a certain level of grit or tenacity or thick-skinnedness, if you want to call it that. I'm not sure what it is. And at times, I believe offense is taken where none is intended. So in other words, I think in terms of talking about microaggression, one cannot neglect the, almost to say, the intention. And whether there was in fact intention or not. But I'm kind of more thinking around the levels of assertiveness, because I think these microaggressions will most probably be handled and when a lack of assertiveness is presented or perceived, then that microaggression is not going to be addressed immediately. So that's why I'm kind of just thinking around assertiveness and what
We're losing you somewhat.
Microaggressions live there. Yeah, sorry, Andrew. I think I've tried to kind of summarize what I was thinking of, but the key issue is around the individual levels of assertiveness and what role that plays in the perception of assertiveness.
Yeah. I just want to check with you. Are you talking of the assertiveness on the part of the recipient? Is that what you mean? To be able
yes,
to respond.
That's it. So in other words, to be that ability to respond in the moment. That's what I'm almost calling that level of grit or tenacity. To be able to, once the feeling is there, to be able to respond immediately to the feeling and talking to the feeling. So in other words, perhaps not almost to say saying that I have experienced a microaggression, but perhaps it's simply something like, you know what, I don't understand your comment, or perhaps your comment has made me feel X, Y, and Z. But that requires that level of assertiveness, and I'm wondering what role that plays.
Yeah. Let's take Sane. Sane, do you have a comment on that?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I do. And I'm joining a bit late to the party. I think if I just hear Andre's comments, the question that comes to mind for me personally is, in order for you to be able to speak up, you must feel a certain level of psychological safety. And it doesn't matter whether how assertive you are, if you don't feel that, you are probably not likely to speak up. I think then it also questions, does our environment support the notion that assertive people get heard? And if you're not assertive, then you will experience microaggressions. And do we value diversity within our environment? Do we create a sense of belonging so that no matter where you are on the spectrum of whether you're assertive or not, you can have a voice and be heard within our environment, I think is important. And no matter how big a challenge is or how small it is, if people feel they can speak up without consequence, then that psychological safety enables them to ask, I wasn't comfortable with this. What did you mean by it? But you could be the most assertive person, but if you believe there might be personal consequence, you are unlikely to speak up in that environment.
I think Andrew, it goes back to what you have mentioned about also creating awareness around the issue of microaggression, because possibilities are that it is happening and staff members are not aware that this is microaggression or another way of being bullied or another way of being stereotyped, which is being used indirectly. What Sane is saying, it's very important to say, if there's a culture of victimization within the organization, it's going to be very difficult for one, however assertive they are, to say how they feel to the people that they know that at some point this is going to come back to bite me. So they will take it in, and at some point it will get to a point where you will start seeing it from the way that they work. So from the way that they work, the work attendance, the morale and all that, maybe in the process of creating awareness around microaggression, what we also need to do is to also emphasize the impact of these actions on the bigger scheme of things, to say, where will we see the impact that these subtle remarks and comments are going to have on the staff members that will be meted this action to. So I think in the creation of awareness, we can just maybe expand it to that, to say the impact, are you aware of what damage you are doing to the people, whether the well-being of the organization or the well-being of the employees that have got to go through these actions that you are measuring to them. Yes.
It's almost like saying, and a little bit like sexual harassment in the workplace, we have to on the side of caution when it comes to that, because you do not know when exactly the line could be crossed with regard to it. And therefore, perhaps a rule of thumb would be to say, let's err on the side of caution. Tatiana, I will take you. I just want to hear some more from the floor. Nompumelelo, please come in.
Nompumelelo, your hand is up. You can talk.
Sorry, my bad. I didn't unmute myself. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm agreeing with what the previous speaker just mentioned, and as well as what Sane was saying. I'm just also responding partly to Andre's comment. I think for me, it speaks to the issue of that awareness, because for me, this is more systemic than individual. So responding at an individual level in terms of your assertiveness as Nompumelelo, how much change would that have in the whole entire spectrum of your systemic issues that we're facing in terms of this issue. So I think for me that it's the issue of awareness, and also I've just lost my train of thought because I'm walking, sorry. But I think the biggest issue was that awareness. Okay, I think the second point was because these comments, they are mostly stereotypical in nature. So yes, I may take it personally at that particular time and respond, but how many more other comments am I going to respond to? So literally in each and every meeting, I must come prepared that there might just be a comment that I need to assert myself in and respond to. And hence I'm saying, I think the issue goes back to getting the system right. Thank you. Or rather bringing in awareness, yeah.
Thanks, Nompumelelo. And Diane, you also speak about that caution. Do you want to say a little bit more about it?
So I'd like to just share with you, the other day, I was facilitating a conflict management workshop with a very senior bunch of people. And the leader, who was a woman, said, in defense of her own actions, I trust every one of these little leaders in the room. And her intent was to be protective towards her exco. They heard it as being made to feel less than and little. So we really do have to be cautious about what we intend and what we actually reveal. And I picked her out. I called her on it because I just saw the whole group of 11 people withdraw into themselves. I called her on it and she said, did I say that? And everybody around the table said yes. And then we explored how that made them all feel. Mixed group, mixed races, but they were all diminished by her saying, I have the backs of these little leaders. I'm always looking after these little leaders.
Yeah.
It's a real concrete example.
It's exactly that. What we intend might not be experienced as such, and therefore we have to be careful about that.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that, Diane. So unless there's other comments, I'm going to ask Tatiana to comment and then to also just summarize our thinking here.
I think, you know, what sparked my interest in the conversation around microaggressions is that because it's systemic and it's so subtle, you know, so there's almost this contradiction around it goes deep, but it's also, it can be very superficial. And on the back of the revised harassment, the revised harassment codes, I think this fits into how we need to be more proactive around addressing microaggressions in the workplace. I recently attended a seminar on the harassment codes, and I was quite intrigued to find out that when you respond in an email to say as previously discussed or as mentioned before, that can be considered harassment. You know, so if we're going to that level of detail or a simple statement as discussed previously, then we need to have conversations around my hair, my accent, how I show up, where I come from. Those things also need to be brought to the fore, and we need to have open discussions around it in the workplace.
No, thanks for that, Tatiana. And I think, colleagues, the issue around topics like, for example, microaggressions that is so subtle becomes very critical for us to talk about, because we don't necessarily deal with overt racism, for example, because that has been outlawed. And so people, you know, there could be an argument that some people could make, well, there's no longer institutional racism, but it could be perpetuated by this type of behavior coming through in kind of microaggressions, and how people feel that, well, although we can overtly now say there is no racism, at least in the law and in the institution, it perpetuates, you know, how people begin to feel about it, and hence the need to have a sensitivity to it, and certainly to be informed about it, as many of us have said, that there need to be awareness about this kind of issues, because it's part of perpetuating also the big issue that we are talking about, the systemic racism that continues, because it sits in the system. It's no longer so visible. Microaggressions is a little bit like that too, and hence a need for us to be educated and inform others about it. Colleagues, we kind of at the end of our webinar, and it's a clumsy conversation. As we say in all of them, it's never intended to try and find the final answers, to say, let's inform ourselves, let's talk about this issue. And even more importantly, the issues within the context, for example, of racism or even issues of gender, that we normalize conversation around it, that people don't have to shy away from it. We say we can talk about these topics and we can do so in a sober manner. Sensitive, it is very difficult topics, but we are willing to engage the conversation around it. And that's one of our key kind of objectives with the Clumsy Conversations. Let's normalize talking about it, because we are trying to overcome these issues that are perpetually in our face, and often in the case of racism, where Black people just experience racism. So when somebody, and that's a very good example actually, when somebody says to you, let's stop talking about race, it's almost invalidating. There's a very good example of microaggression. It's invalidating the racism that I continue to experience to a bigger or lesser extent. I mean, so it's that kind of conversation that needs to happen, and that we need to continue to do so with regard to these particular topics. And I just want to thank all of you. First of all, Tatiana, for having led us on this conversation, and for everybody participating. Even, you know, it doesn't matter whether you've said something, participating here, maybe informing yourself, hopefully with a view that we can inform others also about these issues. As IOPs, to a large extent in organizations, we have leverage to begin to influence some of these type of conversations within organizations. So I just want to say to you, thank you for everybody who has participated today and has been here. We're looking forward to see you there again in the future. Our rallying call, Fiona, as you will remember from the last time, is each one bring one. So if you come to the next one, and we will indicate when that will be, bring somebody with you. Fiona, we're going to hold you to it. I think you're trying to just hide now around this issue, unless you brought somebody today. Maybe you did bring somebody. But that's our rallying call, colleagues. Each one bring one. Fiona, you wanted to say something?
I did invite a few, but I don't see them here. So I did.
Okay. No, at least you've done that. Thanks, Fiona. Thanks very much, colleagues. I wish you a lovely evening. And a final word from you, Tatiana?
Thank you everyone for your attendance and for the conversations. There's never finality, but yeah, we're leaving you with food for thought. And let's keep the Clumsy Conversations going. Good night from my side.
Thanks, everyone.